Free trade meant something else in China. In the early 1800s, free trade meant the right of the British capitalists to freely trade opium in China without any restriction from the Chinese government. It forced the Chinese market, they said, was going to be forced open. And the Chinese government was determined to stop the opium trade. So imposing free trade of opium on China meant war with China. It meant occupation and conquest and pillage. It meant British merchants who wanted the silk and the tea and the porcelain and the spices for markets in the West, but they refused to pay in silver. They demanded the right to pay in opium. And their gunboats smashed the Chinese Navy. There were two wars called the First Opium War and the Second Opium War, 1839 and then 1856, where they literally roared into the harbors of China, burned the cities. This was on the coast and into the rivers of China. And they did succeed in imposing the opium trade. Now, the British ships coming in to the Chinese rivers and the coastal areas, they called this freedom of navigation, that these gunboats had the right to go everywhere. And it had, again, nothing to do with freedom for you or me or anyone in this room or anyone of our class. Freedom of navigation meant the freedom to send gunboats to impose free trade, and to do so very violently. For more than 100 years, the imperialists invoked this freedom of navigation to completely dominate Chinese trade. And U.S. and British gunboats controlled not just the coastal areas, but China's Yangtze and Yellow and Pearl River. They had a whole fleet of river gunboats that controlled the rivers 1,300 and 1,500 miles up the Yangtze River. That's not a small operation. And any Chinese merchants who had warehouses who they wanted to impose a new agreement, well, they could just blast that warehouse right out of existence. It was a very brutal process. And their ability to reach into every major Chinese river, every major city of China, and to protect their, quote, business interests, it was a free looting of China, and it was what China still calls the unequal treaties that were imposed on them. And this was the same era when, of course, the U.S. was imposing unequal treaties on indigenous peoples right here as they stole the land, ripped the resources away, and carried out a genocide right here. Finally, in 1949, with the successful Chinese Revolution, the People's Liberation Army kicked all the foreign forces and their hated battleships from the rivers of China, and they began a socialist construction in an absolutely impoverished country that had been robbed and looted for decades. Mao's famous quote on the day of asserting was, "The Chinese people have stood up." It was a monumental declaration that they would control their own country, their own resources, and push out the foreign powers that had dominated China. It was a monumental accomplishment, and it was earth-shaking, and it really was earth-shaking to U.S. imperialism, who began the witch hunt over who lost China, and blaming many forces right here of the progressive and the communist movement. From the very first minute, U.S. imperialism was completely hostile to People's China's very existence.